Something unfolded on the morning of May 17, 2026, that the Kremlin had little interest in drawing attention to. A Ukrainian drone struck the Moscow oil refinery, the massive Gazprom installation located in the Kapotnya district inside the Russian capital, a facility responsible for supplying close to 40% of fuel demand across the Moscow region. This refinery ranks among the 10 biggest processing plants in Russia, handling nearly 17 million tons of crude oil annually. Operations there stopped, not because the complex had been destroyed beyond repair, but because managers chose to suspend activity as a precaution to reduce potential dangers. 2 industry sources confirmed this to Reuters, while also warning that bringing the plant back online could require several days. 12 people suffered injuries during the attack. Most were construction workers positioned near the entrance area of the facility. But this incident was not isolated. 4 days earlier, on May 15th, Russia's Ryazan refinery, one of the key fuel suppliers for Moscow and among the most strategically critical refining centers in the country, had already halted operations entirely. Then, on May 21st, only days later, Ukrainian drones targeted the Syzran oil refinery in Russia's Samara region, more than 800 kilometers from the Ukrainian frontier. Thick black smoke climbed into the night sky as residents captured footage on mobile phones and uploaded it within minutes. President Volodymyr Zelensky personally shared the videos. He thanked the personnel from the Unmanned Systems Forces and the Special Operations Forces for what he described as precision attacks. He also used a very specific term for these operations: long-range sanctions. That phrase matters because it explains the broader strategy behind Ukraine's campaign. These are not random acts of destruction. The strikes form part of a calculated, sustained, and carefully escalating effort aimed at weakening the industrial foundation that finances and supports Russia's war effort. And according to the available evidence, the strategy has been producing effects that extend far beyond dramatic images of burning infrastructure. Research published by the Baker Institute stated that until 2024, Ukraine did not possess the drone and missile capacity required to maintain repeated long-distance attacks deep inside Russian territory. That changed. And when those capabilities evolved, the consequences for Russia expanded beyond military concerns. Economic pressure increased, social tensions emerged, political complications followed. These were outcomes the Kremlin reportedly neither expected nor fully understood how to manage. The scale of the campaign becomes striking once the numbers are placed together. Ukraine has attacked 24 out of Russia's 33 largest oil refineries since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. The Ryazan and Saratov facilities alone have each been struck 15 separate times. During 2025, between January and early October, 21 of Russia's 38 major refineries were targeted. Successful attacks increased by 48% compared with the entirety of 2024. The result was that approximately 20% of Russia's total refining capability was at least temporarily taken offline. That means 1/5 of the refining capacity belonging to the world's second-largest oil exporter was disrupted. And this did not happen through sanctions packages, diplomatic negotiations, or gradual economic decline. It happened through sustained attacks carried out by a country that, as recently as 2023, many negotiators claimed possessed no meaningful leverage. Now, in 2026, the campaign continues. The number of refineries targeted by Ukrainian drones has doubled since the beginning of the year. Russia's Ryazan refinery suspended activity entirely on May 15th. The Moscow refinery shut down on May 17th. Meanwhile, the Yaroslavl refinery, known as Janos, has reportedly been functioning at roughly 1/4 of its designed capacity. The facilities being selected are no longer secondary or remote industrial sites. These are central components of Russia's core refining network. They supply domestic consumers while simultaneously supporting fuel exports abroad. Ukraine is not merely setting oil facilities on fire, it is cutting through the arteries of the system itself. Yet the deeper significance of these attacks extends beyond military strategy. The less discussed issue, and perhaps the more revealing one, concerns what unfolds inside Russia after these refineries stop operating. The economic chain reaction is not limited to higher fuel prices. It creates political pressure tied directly to one of the most unusual characteristics of how authoritarian energy states manage public stability. Understanding that mechanism explains why Vladimir Putin cannot simply solve the crisis through coercion or state authority alone. It also clarifies why Zelensky's description of these strikes as long-range sanctions was not rhetorical language. It was an exact description of a secondary weapon aimed directly at the relationship between the Kremlin and Russian society. To understand why the refinery campaign reaches far beyond military headlines, it is necessary to examine one of the more revealing features of Russia's domestic economic structure. The starting point is a deceptively simple question. Why would one of the world's largest oil producers subsidize fuel prices for its own population? Russia possesses some of the largest hydrocarbon reserves on Earth. In 2025, profits generated from oil and gas accounted for approximately 77.7% of the federal budget. This is a country whose state finances rely overwhelmingly on energy exports to the rest of the world. Yet for decades, Moscow has maintained a complicated domestic structure designed to ensure Russian citizens pay fuel prices below international market levels. The mechanism carries a specific name inside Russia. It is known as the fuel damper. And once its operation becomes clear, it becomes obvious that the policy is not truly designed as a subsidy for ordinary citizens. It is a subsidy for the stability of the system itself. Since 2019, the Russian government has transferred monthly payments directly from the federal budget to oil companies. The reasoning behind the policy is straightforward. Whenever export prices for refined fuel products rise above domestic prices, oil companies gain a strong financial incentive to redirect as much supply as possible toward foreign buyers, while reducing volumes available for Russian consumers. The damper system compensates these companies for choosing not to do that. The system covers the gap between what oil companies could make through exports and what they receive selling fuel inside Russia. That arrangement guarantees continued supply to the domestic market, while prices remain under state control. According to figures from 2024, Russian oil firms collected 1.815 trillion rubles from the federal budget through the fuel damper structure. In 2023, the amount reached 1.588 trillion rubles. That equals approximately 23 billion US dollars in 2024 alone, spent entirely to prevent gasoline prices from rising. At first glance, a logical question appears. Why not allow fuel prices to move freely with the market, collect larger tax revenues, and then redistribute some of that money directly back to citizens? The answer exposes something much deeper about how authoritarian systems maintain control. The earlier framing of this issue was accurate, but by 2025 and 2026, the Russian version of the problem had become far more severe. The fuel damper is more than an economic subsidy. It functions as a mechanism of political commitment. It is the Kremlin's method of signaling a promise to the Russian population in a form that cannot be quietly hidden or gradually removed. Everyone sees it. Everyone understands it at the exact same moment. Under an authoritarian government, citizens face a basic dilemma. They cannot reliably verify how much money the state is actually earning. Nor can they trust verbal assurances that the wealth will eventually be shared with the public once tensions ease, and the government no longer depends on popular patience. Democratic systems operate with oversight structures, public reporting institutions, and transparent budget mechanisms. Authoritarian systems do not. A government can simply claim oil revenues declined during a difficult year and retain the difference without meaningful accountability. Energy subsidies solve that trust issue in a highly specific way. Citizens do not need access to official accounting records. They only need to look at the price displayed at the fuel pump. Everyone sees it simultaneously. And if those prices rise, the entire country notices at the same time as well. That political reality transforms energy subsidies into something far beyond ordinary economic policy. They become a coordination signal. If the Kremlin attempts to retreat from the arrangement, the evidence does not remain buried inside technical financial documents read only by specialists. It appears openly on fuel station signs across the nation. Every driver sees it. Every farmer notices it. Truck operators notice it. Families preparing for travel notice it. And all of them know everyone else is seeing the same thing simultaneously. In effect, the gasoline price board becomes a permanent public trigger for collective action. Authoritarian governments devote enormous effort toward preventing coordinated public responses. Subsidized fuel happens to be one of the rare policy areas where reversing course instantly creates a visible nationwide point of unity. The Kremlin already learned this lesson during the gasoline crisis of 2023. When authorities attempted to sharply cut fuel damper payments, shortages emerged locally, forcing the government to reverse course. That experience shaped decisions made throughout 2025. As the Ukrainian drone campaign intensified during August of that year, domestic consequences spread with alarming speed across enormous geographic areas. Wholesale gasoline prices climbed more than 50% compared with January 2025, reaching record levels. Diesel prices increased nearly 10% within only 1 month. Authorities in annexed Crimea introduced limits restricting drivers to 30 liters of gasoline per purchase, as shortages disrupted supplies across the peninsula. Throughout Russia's southern federal district, more than 220 gas stations, approximately 14% of the total, stopped fuel sales entirely. The shortages spread rapidly. Gasoline rationing appeared from Russia's western Baltic enclave of Kaliningrad all the way to Vladivostok. In parts of the Far East, drivers were restricted to between 10 and 20 liters during each visit, assuming gasoline could even be found. In some areas, only diesel remained available. Russian state media initially described the situation using explanations that included scheduled refinery maintenance, transportation bottlenecks, and unfavorable weather conditions. Regional officials, caught between Kremlin narratives and the conditions they were actually confronting, quietly acknowledged the rationing was genuine. According to estimates from the BBC, at least 57 Russian regions experienced fuel shortages after Ukrainian attacks targeted Russian refineries. This was not an isolated inconvenience affecting one province. It represented a nationwide fracture in the social arrangement the Kremlin had spent years constructing carefully. And Moscow's response revealed how constrained the government had become. Vladimir Putin signed a decree preventing the suspension of compensation payments to oil companies under the fuel damper system. The policy was scheduled to remain active until May 2026. Its purpose was to maintain stable domestic gasoline and diesel prices, even while wholesale market costs moved far above government limits. In other words, the Kremlin answered a crisis caused by physical refinery damage with larger financial compensation programs. Authorities also blended aviation kerosene into diesel fuel to create substitute supplies. The measure resembled emergency improvisation more than long-term economic policy. At the same time, Russia prohibited gasoline exports, then later restricted diesel exports as well. Those bans were repeatedly extended through the remainder of 2025 and into 2026. The Kremlin sacrificed export income in an attempt to prevent visible collapse inside the domestic fuel market. But the central problem remained unchanged. Every one of those measures functioned only as a temporary workaround. None of them rebuilt destroyed refinery capacity. Stepping back from the economics reveals the broader military strategy Ukraine has been constructing. At that point, the story stops being only about fuel policy and becomes something much more troubling for Moscow. The refinery campaign was not random. It was not a collection of isolated strikes carried out whenever drones happened to be available. Across 2024, 2025, and now 2026, a structured doctrine emerged. A deliberate, carefully sequenced, steadily escalating model of economic warfare pushed Russia into a series of contradictions it could not resolve simultaneously. To understand how that strategy evolved, it is necessary to return to the beginning. Before 2024 and 2025, Ukraine lacked the missile and drone capability required to sustain long-range attacks deep inside Russian territory. The first Ukrainian strikes deep inside Russia happened only occasionally. They created financial losses and operational headaches, but they did not produce systemic breakdowns. The Kremlin could absorb the damage. Refineries usually returned to operation within several weeks. Export income remained mostly stable, and Moscow could still persuade the Russian public that Ukrainian attacks represented irritation rather than a direct danger to ordinary life inside the country. That narrative shattered in August 2025. What changed was not only the number of strikes, the entire strategic structure evolved. Ukraine stopped focusing on destroying single facilities and instead shifted toward overwhelming Russia's ability to repair them. Independent oil and gas analyst Boris Ehrenstein explained that the scale, coordination, and repeated waves of drone operations prevented Russia from restoring damaged refineries before new attacks arrived. That observation reveals the core principle behind the campaign. A refinery does not need to be erased permanently if it can be prevented from fully recovering between successive strikes. Ukraine targeted Russian oil infrastructure more than 140 times during 2025. That represented an increase exceeding 50% compared with 2024. The Tuapse Rosneft refinery on the Black Sea suffered 4 separate attacks during a 2-week period in April and May of 2026 alone. Fires reignited even after Russia's Emergency Situations Ministry had already announced they were extinguished. The cumulative effect was not simply dramatic footage of burning industrial complexes. The deeper impact came from suppressing refining capacity below the level where Russia's reserve systems and improvised repair structures could compensate. Russia's average refinery throughput fell to 4.69 million barrels per day, the lowest level recorded since December 2009, marking a 17-year low. For a country that presents itself internationally as an energy superpower, that figure carries enormous significance. Russia has quietly depended for decades on Soviet-era infrastructure built for an industrial economy larger than the one that exists today. Excess capacity left over from that period provided redundancy. Now that foundation is being worn down faster than it can be restored, Moscow has relied on a combination of Soviet-inherited infrastructure and patchwork repair methods. But if Ukraine increases the pace of attacks again while introducing heavier weapons, Russia's ability to rebuild damaged facilities will likely continue deteriorating. Export volumes would decline alongside it. That transition is already happening. Ukraine is developing and integrating larger domestically produced missile systems, including the FP-5 Flamingo and the Long Neptune. These weapons are intended specifically for high-yield strikes against hardened industrial targets that smaller drone warheads can damage but not fully disable. There is another factor that receives far less attention. Russia is attempting to restore these facilities while operating under Western sanctions that restrict access to specialized foreign components required for modern refinery maintenance. Export data from January 2026 showed seaborne crude shipments declining to 3.04 million barrels per day. The figures reflected both production limitations and restricted market access. Sanctions enforcement has also complicated Russia's ability to obtain critical industrial equipment through third-party supply routes. Before the war, sourcing many of these components required only weeks. Now the same process takes months as shipments move through hidden procurement networks, and every additional week of delay creates another opportunity for drones to strike the same facilities again. The broader strategic pattern reveals something important about how Ukraine has absorbed the logic of economic warfare. When Volodymyr Zelensky described these attacks as long-range sanctions, the wording was intentional. Traditional sanctions usually operate by restricting a country's access to technology and revenue at international borders. They are blunt instruments that impact entire economies and often place heavy burdens on civilian populations, creating political backlash inside democratic societies that eventually pushes governments toward easing restrictions. Drone attacks against refineries produce a structurally similar effect, but with far greater precision. The strikes do not deprive Russia of crude oil reserves. Russia still possesses the crude itself. Since 2024, Russian crude oil exports remained relatively steady. However, exports of refined fuel products declined. That divergence signals a major shift. Ukrainian attacks have clearly damaged a substantial portion of Russia's refining network, limiting the ability of facilities to process crude and produce refined fuels. As a result, larger volumes of crude oil have been redirected away from domestic refineries and toward export markets. Russia can still sell raw crude to India and China. What it is increasingly struggling to do is transform that crude into diesel, aviation fuel, and motor gasoline, the refined products required both for military operations and for the functioning of the domestic economy. The military implications are enormous. A source inside the security service of Ukraine stated that nearly 40% of Russian refining capacity now sits idle because of the long-range strike campaign. The reduction in petrodollar revenue directly affects Russia's capacity to continue financing the war. Russian military logistics consume refined fuel on a massive scale that many outside observers consistently underestimate. Tanks require it. Armored vehicles depend on it. Artillery systems consume it. Helicopter missions rely on it. Troop transport networks need it constantly. All of it runs on refined petroleum products. When a country fighting a large-scale land war experiences compression of its domestic refined fuel supply, difficult allocation decisions become unavoidable. The International Energy Agency stated that Ukrainian drone attacks were expected to suppress refinery processing levels across Russia's critical oil industry until at least the middle of 2026. That assessment was published in October 2025. It has proven accurate. As of the final week of May 2026, the drone campaign has not slowed. It has intensified. Strikes are now reaching facilities located more than 1,500 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. What makes the doctrine especially sophisticated is that the vulnerability being exploited is not mainly military, it is political. Every refinery removed from operation creates more than a logistical challenge for Russian military planners. It changes the numbers displayed at fuel stations. It creates long lines of civilians waiting in Moscow, Vladivostok, or Kaliningrad. People standing there witness the same problem unfolding together, and each person understands everyone else is watching too. Ukraine has discovered a way to strike both Russia's military capacity and the social agreement between the Kremlin and its own population using the same weapon system at the same time. For Moscow, that reality reaches far beyond the refinery fires themselves. If you want more deep analysis on military strategy, geopolitical conflict, and the hidden mechanics shaping global events, stay with us for the next report. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.